Clashes erupted near Zuccotti Park after police moved in to clear it out hours earlier.
Tear gas and armored tanks became a familiar sight in Ferguson, Missouri.
This is a disproportionate response against predominantly non-violent protesters.
We've heard quite a bit about the institution of the police lately. We see officers in places like Portland or Minneapolis sporting military weapons, driving armored personnel carriers, and dressed like the jackboots from a dystopian 70s film. It's hard to see these people in your neighborhood without feeling like you're under attack. How do we become comfortable with this? A state of affairs where armed agents of the state can attack our neighbors in the streets of our hometowns? Well, it all began with a mentality. Public policy scholar Joy Rose argues that the militarizing of the police is more than just guns and tanks, but is actually a mindset, a tendency to see the world through the lens of national security, a tendency to exaggerate existing threats. If images and stories of police assaulting citizens is news to you, congratulations on being born white. I am sorry to all my POC viewers, I have to explain something you're all painfully familiar with to people like me who grew up with a complexion that allows us to live with our eyes and ears firmly closed. This isn't going to be a complete history of the racist and anti-workers' rights institution that is the police. You can get that in great detail through Robert Evans's podcast Behind the Police, and I heartily recommend you check that out. The TLDL of the podcast is that the institution of what would become policing in America began in colonial times based on a system of sheriffs and militias the British developed through the colonization of the Irish. After independence, American policing focused on slave patrols in the South and the suppression of organized labor in the North.
Police really evolved around a lot what I would call labor control. And so in the South, that was controlling slaves, but in the North, that actually had to do with controlling any inconvenient population, especially labor. And so the institution of policing is very much connected to the enactment of violence against strikers and union breaking.
These organizations were haphazard and disorganized until the early 20th century, when tactics taken from the American colonization of the Philippines turned them into a professionalized system of colonial officers. For the most part, though, their access to munitions and tactics from the military was virtually non-existent. The only exception would be the FBI using automatic weapons in an arms race with the mob in the 1930s. The real escalation of the police's militarization came from the 1950s and 1960s, a special time of peace and harmony in America, I assume. Now I'm just going to take a big old sip of water and Google those decades real quick.
Commissioner Bull Connor put nonviolent resistance to its severest test with his brutal treatment of the demonstrators.
Chicago under siege during the spring and summer of 1968.
Wow, that's really shocking. The police had to deal with many riots and protests during these decades, especially race riots. Many police saw success in using military weapons and tactics to put them down, like the Watts riot of 1965 in Los Angeles, which started when the LAPD beat the shit out of a 20-year-old black man in front of a crowd. See. The black community of LA broke out in understandable anger against the racism and brutality done by the police. To de-escalate the situation, the government sent in the California National Guard to brutally quell the riots, killing over 30 people and injuring thousands in the process. That same year, Congress passed the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, or LEAA, skyrocketing resources given to police at various levels around the country for training and, quote, projects designed to improve the capabilities, techniques, and practices of state and local agencies charged with law enforcement and related responsibilities. President Ronald Reagan also expanded the funding and scope of the act in 1985 thanks to crucial support from Joe Biden. The LEAA was more or less the beginning of the militarization of the police. The force would grow in power, and politicians would greenlight more weapons, more military training, and fewer checks on their power. So, why? Why did this happen? And what were the consequences? Also, if you're good, we can get into kind of near the end about what we can do about it.
But first,
this is a challenging topic to cover and will likely be demonetized. Many sponsors would walk away from it. This is why I must thank the very supportive sponsor for today's video, Skillshare. Time and time again, Skillshare has supported important videos that I've made on difficult subjects, and I'm very grateful for that. Skillshare is a learning community where millions come together to learn new skills. We're moving to a world where what you can do for people is much more important than simple accreditation. Skillshare is a place to invest in yourself by learning skills like illustration, design, photography, video, or freelancing. Pretty much everything that I know about video making and writing come from Skillshare classes, and the service costs less than $10 a month. I'm right now taking a course that's introducing me to the world of After Effects, done by the talented Jordi Vandeput. I have ambitions, despite people really disliking it when I try narratives or skits. I might be cringe, but I am free. If you want to give it a shot, you can see down in the description and pinned comment, there's a link. The first 1,000 people to use it get a free trial of Skillshare's premium membership. Now, onwards to the militarized police. Dear God. Military weapons flooded into civilian policing in the name of fighting civil disturbances and drugs. So let's start with those. The backlash against civil disturbances has always been focused on a specific group of people. The need for riot control seemed focused on race riots in the 1950s, race riots in the 1960s, and race riots in the 1970s. These violent clashes peppered the civil rights movement and could be a subject for an entire YouTube channel, let alone video. Police also felt the need to crack down on the kids who didn't want to die in a pointless war in Vietnam. How dare they? So to ensure there was never another civil rights or anti-war movement, the police needed some powerful, deadly toys to suppress them. Hence why police went from looking like this to looking like this. But by the 1970s, you couldn't be explicitly racist in political communications anymore. To make opposing the state or being black a crime, you need to turn normal people into criminals. Luckily, Richard Nixon had a plan. Let's talk about the war on drugs. From the beginning, the whole concept seemed a little odd. Why isn't nicotine or alcohol on this list, when cannabis is a much safer substance? That's a little weird, isn't it? It's almost as if such a decision was made without even considering the effects on health. It also seemed a little unequal in its enforcement. Despite equal use of cannabis across racial lines, it seems to have been enforced overwhelmingly on, you know, black and brown people. But Nixon, the father of the war on drugs, might not have known any of that. Maybe he was just misinformed. Too bad that there's nobody out there associated with the White House who spilt the beans on the administration designing the war on drugs as a war on civil disobedience and the left and black people. Okay, let's just talk about John Ehrlichman then. Ehrlichman was a domestic affairs advisor to Nixon and even did jail time for being involved in Watergate. So he was pretty close to old Tricky Dick in his trickiest moments. In 1994, he gave an interview to Harper's Magazine where he admitted to the whole thing.
The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Oof. That's not a good look for a guy with as stellar a reputation as Nixon's. So, we should see the expansion of the war on drugs for what it really was, deep down. A war on civil disobedience and being black. In 1981, Reagan, the Gipper himself, in the name of continuing the war on drugs, passed the Military Cooperation with Civilian Law Enforcement Agencies Act, which is as terrifying as it sounds. It allowed the military to cooperate with the police, particularly in counter-drug operations and, quote, civil disturbances. Furthermore, they trained for normal and everyday occurrences the police handle all the time, like bomb disposal and counter-terrorism. Furthermore, Reagan's successor, George Bush, escalated the militarization of the police with the 1033 program. It allowed the over-bloated military budget to continue bloating like some sort of tick directed by David Cronenberg. 1033 allowed for the military to transfer excess equipment to civilian police agencies. The bill had bipartisan support and even expanded under the Democratic Clinton regime. President Barack Obama put some limits on what kinds of assets the military could transfer, but President Donald Trump rescinded that reform. And Joe Biden has yet to reverse that reversal. There's an Uno joke in there somewhere. The consequences of this influx of weapons, military training, and legal protections from brutal violence are numerous. In some of the most infamous standoffs, the very name of the town they happened in is synonymous with militarized police. Think of towns like Waco or Ruby Ridge. These two I will talk about specifically in the next episode of the White Power series, so I won't go into them today. More than just equipment and training, the police also gained fewer controls over their power. After 9/11, the limits put on officers under the Fourth Amendment for performing searches and seizures became much easier to get around if you could just somehow say the word terrorism. Thank you, 2001 Patriot Act. So of course, the word terrorism was about to get its definition stretched out beyond all recognition, to the point where when I took a war on terror course as part of grad school, the National Security Dictionary we used had a 4-page definition for the word terrorism. Police were even able to perform sneak and peek searches, which allowed them to break into a home or business without any judge signing a warrant. If you want your militarization a little more literal, during Hurricane Katrina, the government literally outsourced policing to Blackwater, a private mercenary company. Scatter reports also suggest police officers during Katrina were summarily executing looters. During the Occupy Wall Street protests, police were reported using battlefield tactics in a wildly excessive crackdown on people camping out in a park, insisting the government do something about income inequality. Those monsters. And we can't talk about the militarization of the police without talking about the brutality on display during the first and second waves of Black Lives Matter protests. The police came out with snipers and armored personnel carriers to react to protesters in Ferguson who were angry over the gross misjustice in the police murder of Michael Brown in 2014. And in last year's Black Lives Matter protests, we saw the occupying army in full swing. Whether you want to refer to the federal agents tear gassing people in front of the White House to preserve a photo op, or the unmarked vans disappearing protesters in Portland, or the countless pieces of footage of police brutalizing harmless people. It was a real display of just how far the police had come in seeing the populace as enemy insurgents who need to be put down. And this influx of military training and equipment has consequences. Let's just talk about one example, like the time the police bombed a black neighborhood in Philadelphia. In 1985, an anarcho-primitivist black separatist group called MOVE lived in a row house in West Philadelphia. Because of the neighbors' complaints about noise and trash, the police took out arrest warrants on the MOVE members living in the house. Because they might have guns, heaven forbid in America, the mayor and police commissioner declared MOVE a terrorist organization. The police evacuated the neighbors and went in with 500 officers. When the residents of the MOVE house didn't respond to this threat, the officers then tried to break in to remove them. For the record, this is a response to about 13 people living in the house, 5 of which were children. The police threw tear gas into the building, which is a banned weapon under the Geneva Convention, by the way, and that escalation tactic provoked an armed standoff in which the police dumped over 10,000 rounds of ammunition into the house. No matter how many times the police gassed or shot them, the members of MOVE just didn't seem to want to leave. The police needed a new way to get in, and so they did the only sensible thing to try and convince them to leave when children are in danger. They dropped a bomb from a helicopter onto the roof of a house. It caused a massive fire that killed 11 of those 13 people, including all of the children. But wait, there's more! The fire then spread to 65 more houses and burned them to the ground. During this inferno, the police stopped firefighters from trying to put out the blaze. One member of MOVE claimed that the police fired upon the 2 survivors who escaped. And hey, just for kicks, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology kept some of the children's remains as fun artifacts to play with when teaching forensics. And as has been the fate of far too many black bodies in history, nobody asked for permission. This very month, May of 2021, the health commissioner of Philadelphia had to resign for ordering the disposal of the evidence by cremating the remains without identifying them or contacting their families. Luckily, he wasn't successful. Welcome to Step Back, where I make history fun and come alive. Ha 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 ha. This video is brought to you by Skillshare. Now it does seem at long last that people are starting to wake up to the fact that there are armed soldiers patrolling our streets, ready to put down anyone who insists on having civil rights or disagrees with the government order. Black Lives Matter as a movement has brought to the eyes of a lot of white people what people of color have known and experienced for, forever. Now we even hear the occasional brave call to defund the police. Defunding the police would mean stripping back the mammoth budgets of police departments, which can sometimes be as much as half of a city's spending. We'd stop giving armed soldiers the jobs of taking care of homeless people or dealing with people having a mental health crisis. Instead, we would put those jobs in the hands of people equipped to solve them, like social workers and psychiatrists. Police powers would be limited to their specific mandates. The specific things police do. Like, sometimes when you're the victim of a crime, they write down that happened. Sometimes if someone gets murdered, they pass off the report to a detective. And then they show up at protests to make sure that the people who are protesting are in danger. There's actually a braver option. Police abolitionists advocate that we don't actually need the police. It's not as far-fetched as you think, and police abolitionists have been working on it for some time. Instead of beating civilians into submission, let's work on fixing the social problems that cause crime to begin with. Perhaps we could look at crime as more of a way to see policy failure at play and work on making amends, reforming perpetrators, and restoring the broken social contract, rather than shoving people into overcrowded dungeons.
Mom, I know your intentions are good, but aren't the police a protective force that maintains the status quo for the wealthy elites? Don't you think we ought to attack the roots of social problems instead of jamming people into overcrowded prisons?
Look, Lisa, it's McGriff, the crime dog.
It's an idea called restorative justice. There's a whole world out there of ways to do this in theory and practice. Mobile crisis response units, community mediators, designated traffic control officers, and even community self-policing are all ideas already tried before with some success. I could probably make a whole video on these alternatives. Not even considering getting rid of the police is a sign of a lack of imagination. And considering how things are, there must be a better option. Fighting against this occupying force of endo-colonization is a struggle for liberation. I can't conclude much more by looking at the news and researching that the police are, as I've said over and over, anything but an occupying army. An army the state uses to impose its violent power over all of us. How many more people do we need to see beaten, broken, suffocated, and murdered before we say enough is enough? Luckily, though, when that time comes, there's way more of us than there are of them. Fuck 12.